Today on the trail, we're going to be talking about the worsening climate crisis, which has reached a point beyond optimism for most people, especially climate experts. In 2015, the Paris Treaty was signed with Canada there, negotiating, speaking like it was ready to lead. The Paris Treaty goals are now going to be missed, with 1.5 degrees to be surpassed. Often, Westerners like to blame developing nations for their high greenhouse gas emissions, which are on paper significantly higher than those in the West. But the details of this discussion are much more nuanced than we give it credit for. Western consumerism is driving greenhouse gas emissions across the world, and Western travel and desire for flight, endless need for growth, and further wealth is what is leading our current predicament. Today, we're going to solve the climate crisis on the trail. To help me solve the crisis, I have invited two experts from the David Suzuki Foundation, Albert Lalonde and Janelle Lapointe. Janelle's not even from Quebec, but she has an incredibly Quebecois name. They are joining us from COP30. Albert is directing a feature-length documentary about Quebec and Indigenous people, is a leader in youth organizing for the climate, and has been attending COP conferences for years now. They went to the Université de Québec at Montréal for a baccalaureate in law. Meanwhile, Janelle is a well-known senior advisor at the Suzuki Foundation, an Afro-Indigenous climate warrior, an Indigenous rights activist from Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. She is a published author and writer who attended Thompson Rivers University and Simon Fraser with a Bachelor of Tourism, Festival, and Event Management. Sadly, Janelle had to leave part way through this interview, but she gave some of the best quotes in there, and then me and Albert continued to talk for another 20 minutes or so. I do also just want to throw out there that Albert's camera kind of got messed up in the middle of there, so for about half the interview, he doesn't exist. So for those of you watching, I apologize, but you can look at my face for the rest of the interview, just doing this. So I hope you enjoy both of them, and thank you so much to both of them for taking the time well at COP30 to speak to me. The conversation revolves around hope, around criticisms of COP30, and about the future and repoliticizing the climate change crisis. If you enjoy this kind of interview, super in-depth, deep, long, and informative, I encourage you to subscribe, to share this with your friends, to head over to our website and give $5 a month, because it is through you people supporting my channel, supporting my work, and supporting my media that we are able to make this happen. Our goal is to grow so that we can start working with a team instead of just being a one-person show. So please share this, like this, comment below. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Enjoy the interview. Right away, just how is it going at COP30, and how disappointing is this year compared to the last couple of years, which have also been highly disappointing? We'll start with you, Janelle.
Yeah, it's disappointing. Obviously, I came in with low expectations, but given the continuous threat of the United States government and the fact that they're absent this year, I thought gave an opportunity for the rest of the global north to really step up to the plate without the kind of toxicity that the U.S. government often brings to these negotiations. I was also heartened by the mobilization of Indigenous people in the Amazon leading up to COP30. This is being deemed the Indigenous COP, and we've also heard them use the tag the COP of truth. But after week one, what we saw was massive mobilizations of Indigenous people yet again to have their voices heard at the table, with groups storming the entrance and blocking the entrance just to get a meeting with the presidency. And that's been met with really high numbers of police and military presence starting off week two. Meanwhile, Kick Big Polluters Out really support that there are 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists present at COP30, and that's about one for every 25 attending. Right. So I'm really struck by just the hypocrisy of barring the people that are on the front line of this crisis and front line of development, while we let the fossil fuel lobby waltz in the door. So yeah, it's definitely, it's a circus, and I'm feeling pretty disappointed starting off week two.
Albert, how are you feeling?
I mean, my expectations, I think a COP is a COP, and we have this like I've done so many interviews by this point, being like, "Oh, this is the COP of the last chance." Yada yada. And we were saying this like at COP21 where the Paris Agreement was signed, right? To some extent. And so I think that cops are cops are cops and they're also full of cops, but we just it's just every day more army. Like it's really disgusting, as Janelle was saying, and every day the fences go further, and every day you're just like they you need to show your badge earlier on in your route to enter the venue. But that's just to say, I think that this space is deeply flawed. However, I think it's also perhaps more interesting to blame the states because the UNFCCC is far from perfect, inherently colonial. Just the fact that it recognizes that, indigenous organizations worldwide, despite being sovereign on their territories, can only obtain observer badges in 90% of the time, right? And like are just completely maintained outside of the negotiations most of the time. And so there's many issues with the UNFCCC itself. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which COPs are the main negotiating body for. But then I think it's also in how it works with unanimous decision making. And so it's also states such as Canada that are impeding any progress. And so every COP, people are disheartened to see how this is not working, etc. But I think that, like instead of having always articles about how cops don't work, we need to also focus our reflections on why and who intentionally derails every COP. And that includes Canada very proactively. Canada, like the ministers couldn't be bothered to be here for the whole time. There's promotion of bioengineering at the Canadian Pavilion with like, oh, we're going to put fertilizer in the ocean. And so the algae are going to like capture more carbon. And so, not mentioning that this carbon is going to be released in like 2 days, or like advocating to change the composition of the atmosphere so that, like the capitalist system can just keep going. And so, and that's, I think, emblematic, like the most important, and COP is an industrial fair, but the heart of it is the negotiations, really, and which are often sidelined and forgotten of. It's very easy to forget the negotiations, and there's several streams of negotiations simultaneously, and it's all very technical. But, for example, on funding, right now you see the EU, countries such as Canada, in a real struggle against global South countries who need funding. And the Brazilian presidency had this objective of reaching 1 point in climate funding to global South countries by the end of this COP. We're very far away from that. And right now, the EU and Canada and are just trying to, instead of having a proper mechanism for how the actual funds can be transferred from global North industrialized countries to global South countries with lesser historical emissions, they're trying to they're just really fighting against having any sort of mechanism in place, and all they want is to have more talks and more delay. And it's also difficult at COP because like no one is against virtue, but everyone will make it like a lot of actors will do everything so that they can derail the whole process. And so yeah, that's that. And then the questions are endless. There's I think I don't remember which country. There's a new program on gender and new negotiations on the inclusion of gender in UNFCCC negotiations, for example. And then, some countries were opposing the use of the term gender. So, like every political debate that you see in the world kind of reflects at COP, and as well as the geopolitical complexities of everything. Like Pacific Island states are incredibly powerful voices. They're threatened existentially. Their ability to act is limited by the fact that like colonialism has made that like economically reliant on the United States, for example, which is why probably many of them are hesitant to do what the International Court of Justice told them to do in its advisory opinion on state obligations regarding climate change, released this summer, which is like sue global North countries, for example.
Janelle, I would like to know more of your thoughts around why. I mean, as you said, there's one lobbyist for 20 attendees. Why are they not willing to engage with the indigenous? Why is there such a resistance to hearing people who are living the effects of the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, Indigenous people continue to be the biggest impediments of what they would consider progress, which is honestly ultimately affecting the bottom line of a lot of these fossil fuel lobbyist companies. Yeah, really disappointed, even from a Canada perspective. I mean, I'm sitting here as a rights holder from Tsleil-Waututh Nation, someone whose territory is going to be majorly affected by Prime Minister Carney's recent announcement I'm stuck with an observer badge. Well, about a dozen or so fossil fuel companies have official Canadian party delegation badges. So I think it's really showing that the states are more aligned with corporate interests and squeezing our territories for every last dime under this dying capitalist regime, and are happy to just let us kind of bang on the walls from the outside. Continuously disappointing. Last week, when we had the Minister of Environment and Climate Change here, Minister Julie DeBrusen, I had the opportunity to sit down with her the day after Prime Minister Carney's recent announcements under the Major Projects Office, and to ask her, like, how are you squaring this circle? She came into COP promising that Canada was committed to keeping the world below 1.5 degrees, which is something Prime Minister Carney has been dancing around. He's been saying that he's not focused on the Paris Agreement, that he does results, not targets, whatever the hell that means.
That's some
And
liberal bullshit.
yes, like our results are going to mean like continuous climate disasters, and Canada is a global north country that now has climate refugees year after year. I mean, we all know someone, and we all have been affected by the climate crisis, whether that's the floods, the droughts, the fires, the heat. Um, and so, yeah, it was interesting to see Minister DeBrusen come in saying all the right words. And then when I had the opportunity to ask her face to face, where the hell is our Just Transition Act? Why are we leaving Indigenous communities with the crumbs of a LNG industry that we know was going to peak and begin to plateau at 2030? So I'm worried about my community being stuck with stranded assets and the environmental impacts, the health impacts, and just like whether she thinks that we can actually make those commitments with the Major Projects Office and with this new legislation, Bill C5. And she didn't have a good answer for me. My colleague, Willow Prince, who works at Indigenous Climate Action, reiterated the question to her, are you okay with Indigenous communities remaining in the sacrifice zone? Yes or no? This is a yes or no question. And she couldn't even say no, which was really surprising to us. Really, of course, was not expecting anything other than a political answer, but I was struck by her ability to look me square in the pupils and to lie.
That's
I
crazy.
don't think.
It's crazy that she
Yes,
couldn't just say no.
yes,
Are you okay with Indigenous people suffering? Like, no. It's not a hard question.
yeah. Instead, she danced around, and I'm asking questions specifically about my territory as
Yeah.
a rights holder, and she's instead telling me, well, the government's doing a really good project with an Indigenous community hundreds of kilometers away from you, and so that's a liberal government tactic. You ask them a hard question, they're going to prop up another Indigenous nation or Indigenous person in your face instead of answering to you. She also started off the panel bragging that what Canada brings to negotiations is their respect for women, and that they're friendly to LGBTQI plus people. And I grew up along the Highway of Tears, where Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit are disproportionately found missing and murdered. And these projects bring in massive man camps to our communities that bring in a poison drug supply and extreme violence against our women, girls, and queer people. And so I asked her, I said, how are you breaking about that, where these projects that were just announced yesterday are going to bring harm to my community? And she gave me some answer about how she's committed to making them like safe work sites. Yeah, was really, really disappointed by her answer. And it wasn't just me, civil society who was present in the room. Even those who are maybe not following the major project announcements as closely, or who live far away from some of the announced projects, had so many people come up to me and were struck just by her ability to give me non-answers
Yeah.
at a space where we're expecting Canada to show up as champions. And like Albert said, it's really telling that both ministers left earlier and are not concerned with being present for the rest of week 2. So yeah, I think their presence is going to be a death sentence and bring a lot of harm to Indigenous communities within the borders of colonial Canada, but also to global South and Indigenous communities worldwide.
Yeah, like we're trying to compete with the US on the drill baby drill, and that's absurd. And what you see at COP, what we see is that decarbonation is not happening at the pace that it should, but it is happening. And when is it happening? That's the issue. How is it happening? That's the issue. Because decarbonation only takes place when there are major industrial financial interests at the end. But you see China like exponentially decarbonizing its economy, etc. And so I think that it's also that these capitalists, this extractive vision for Canada where we build more infrastructure for LNG. We already have the Trans Mountain pipeline that was built with $39 billion worth of public money. Like all of this, there's very, very little chances that there will be return on investment. And what you see, one of the most successful ways of organizing against LNG projects is to put pressure on banks and insurers and reinsurers, which like are the insurers of the insurance companies, so that they don't support these projects, which is a bit weird for activists who are not, who don't really believe in the mechanisms of the market, right? But at the end of the day, those projects are incredibly risky financially. Like by the very capitalist logic, they don't make much sense. So I think that Canada is also right now being mediocre at its own game, because even by the classic rules of liberalism and neoliberalism, this like all out resource extraction really makes very little sense. And then when I talk about like how decarbonation happens, that's a huge issue. And that's really front and center here as well, even though many people are trying to brush this under the rug. But, because when we talk about 1.5, I think by what you said, it's not true that the 1.5 objective is dead. Actually, we cannot let the 1.5 objective die. So what's going to happen is, yes, it is very true that we cannot do anything against the fact that global average temperatures are going to increase or have already increased to reach the 1.5 degree thresholds. However, when the IPCC refers to 1.5, it's by the year 2100, so the end of the century. So what we got to do right now is limit to the maximum. And one of the key critical questions is with regards to planetary systems is how long will we be in this window above 1.5? And then, of course, right now we're on our current trajectory, we're never going to curb under 1.5.
Another thing I shared with Minister DeBrusen is that not only do we have the International Energy Agency telling us that oil, gas, LNG is about to peak and plateau, we also have an example from another G7 country, Germany, who had something called the Acceleration Act, which I find very similar to Carney's One Canadian Economy Act. And under their Acceleration Act, they fast-tracked 7 LNG projects, and 6 of them are already abandoned just a mere 3 years later. So I'm, my big piece of my work is calling out how the government is using the weaponized forced systemic poverty of Indigenous nations, and now saying that they're doing reconciliation by offering Indigenous nations partnerships on these major projects. And I just want everyone to know that not only are we going to be left with the health impacts, the environmental impacts, violence to our women, girls, and Two-Spirit, but we're also, we're taking out massive loans to be partners on these projects where we're not going to get the return on investment, which means we're going to be stuck with stranded assets and just another century of poverty while the Canadian elite get richer. The whole thing is just really unacceptable. And I also just want to note that the sidelined terminal, the LNG terminal that was approved, is 100% American owned. It's an Indigenous led project. The Nisga'a tribal government are political partners on the project, but it's 100% owned by Western LNG, which is owned by American billionaires in Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein's inner circle. Yeah, hypocrisy at COP, hypocrisy from Mark Carney, hypocrisy on this specific project. And I think the Canadian public deserves to know that their taxpayer dollars are going to subsidize these projects to get them to the building phase. And then our taxpayer dollars are going to be going to clean up their mess. So yeah, thanks Isaac for having me. I'm going to hop up.
Thank you, Janelle. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. And good luck at COP.
Wonderful. Thanks, Isaac.
Go ahead.
Just want to state Janelle is an icon, a mentor, shining star. Follow her on Instagram. She's publishing a lot of really interesting content about COP, about Indigenous rights. She's fabulous. Don't miss out.
On the Breach, Janelle Lapointe, find her online. Just great work out there for anyone who's interested in this type of stuff.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye.
We need to understand, the premise is that we need to understand the climate as a political issue. And that's the thing that the media never do, right? They love to be like, youth are concerned about the climate crisis. Like I was kind of semi-forced into the perhaps being the prospective Quebec's Greta back in 2019, And everything was always depoliticized, even though that's something that we fought very hard against. And I think that we need to understand climate violence and violence that's inflicted through the atmosphere by major emitters as like a form of fascism. When like 30 million people in Pakistan are displaced every second or third year, that's unspeakable violence on a scale like that's never really been seen. And that's people, people on small island developing states, for example, just seeing their communities get wiped out by hurricanes year after year, where like destruction is faster than reconstruction. And so part of my work is to document these harms. I just came back from right before Brazil to a trip to East Africa to document, what does it mean, like the right to health, right to education? Like, what does it mean if like states and human rights frameworks are only bound to progressively attain these rights, like progressively implement them? But then there's a principle of non-regression where, there's the realization of these rights is not supposed to degrade. But what does it mean, like amidst like collapsing planetary systems, right? And so that's why, like, I would say that it's not a COP problem. It's an entire, like, the problem is with the entire architecture of international law, where the power is like all concentrated in the hands of nation states. But then there's several reasons why I'm at COP and why we still gotta go to COP, and why I think that, like, sometimes going to COP, I've been kind of seen as a sellout by some movement like comrades, and I think that
but those type of people are like, oh, like I have a friend who's a hardcore environmental activist, and but now she works for Le Devoir, and her old activist friends are like, what the fuck? It's like, relax, guys. Like, you gotta do the work.
No, but I just wanted to come back on this narrative of like, every COP for like 10 years we've been saying is the COP of is the last chance, is the yada yada. And at the end of the day, it doesn't make much sense. So in this 1.5 degree thresholds being reached in terms of global average temperature increase, yes. So as of now / very, very soon, we'll have reached this threshold. And the importance of this threshold is that beyond 1.5 degree temperature increase, that's where you see climate tipping points. Because we've degraded the environment, the planetary systems are going to collapse, and that's going to release more carbon into the atmosphere. And so that will like increase the warming exponentially. For example, like permafrost melting, it's full of methane. And when methane is released in the atmosphere, it has greenhouse effects that's, I think, 83 times higher than the warming effect that CO2 has in the atmosphere. So that's disastrous, really disastrous. And so 1.5 degrees, the 1.5 degrees objective is to say, okay, like there's going to be global warming, but we need to try to spare ourselves from this exponential climate chaos. But where we cannot give up on the 1.5, and where the 1.5 will always be relevant, is that, when the IPCC talks about 1.5, it's often for the year 2100. So it's by the end of the century. So we've known for a long time, or we should have known for a long time, it was like fully expected that we would overshoot 1.5 at one point or another, right? And we've exceeded it very early. But now the question is to make sure that we don't stay above 1.5 for very long. We need to stay above 1.5 for the least amount of time possible. And then, so I think that it's important to understand as well that, like, right now, and that's something that's like rarely explained, but I'm trying to get to like how the climate science is political. You have like, right now we're at, I think, 423 parts per million of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. And the level that is deemed safe is 350. So that means that we need to like capture about 1/8 of the CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere. And so that's why, like, when we talk about carbon neutrality for the whole world, in 2050 as a target that's like recommended by the IPCC, first I realized like it's it's all probability scenarios. So even though we do everything perfectly, the probability is, and depending like how we do things, there's like just a plethora of scenarios by the IPCC that are then condensed into like main sort of scenarios. Basically, we never have a 100% chance of being able to like come back to a safe and stable climate, right? But that's to say, carbon neutrality is not it. We need to like capture more carbon than we produce. So, well, first, that means that countries such as Canada, like Canada prides itself of its climate target law. So that's enshrining this objective of carbon neutrality by 2045, if I'm not mistaken. But then it makes absolutely no sense that a country with such high historical and present emissions, such as Canada, would be so late, because like the math simply is not mathing. That means that like if we do that, then that means that because when we talk about global south countries, when we talk about like impoverished populations, then if they cannot like increase their emissions, that means that they're virtually stuck in very bad conditions. And then it also means that like if everyone reduces their emissions by the same like proportions by the same end date, that doesn't work, because when you have very little emissions in the first place, that means that you have a lot less emissions to cut from. So where are you going to cut? You know, when your only emissions come from like very basic things that have nothing to do with big industry or like Western consumerism. So those are like, this is how the science is like super political. And even the 1.5 degree thresholds, it's presented as safe. It's safer, but it's not safe. 1.5 means is synonymous with the disappearance of like 90% of coral reefs, which will have massive, like profound impacts on marine ecosystems, you know, coastal communities' livelihoods, fish stock, obviously, and so food security, sovereignty, etc. So I think that like all these things, it's very important to develop like legibility on them and to be able to say that from that standpoint, like big emitters, like we need to be able to connect like climate harms with as being part of like all the forms of violence that the capitalist system just normalizes. And we need to be able to really use this vocabulary of like, this is violence that's knowingly and intentionally being inflicted by major emitters on the global majority. And I think, you know, one example of that is like communities in small island states getting wiped out by hurricanes faster than they can ever rebuild. One example of this is entire Pacific nations losing everything, you know, losing their land, but also their culture, losing the elements that, and that's true for indigenous peoples worldwide, truly, but harms to the land is like loss of meaning in the languages, because the words stem from the land. It's like sacred sites that are being destroyed. It's like it's a form, like it's one of the tenets of genocide as we see it both in Canada and internationally. And like there is intent. There are industries that have known about this for decades and just kept going. And there are states who like do everything that they, you know, who will have this like flowery vocabulary and be all polite and diplomatic, but who really are unleashing unspeakable violence through their hindrance of any sort of progress in the space. So that brings the question, when I was talking about the fact that we need to capture more carbon than we actually emit, that brings up the fact of like, and that's a huge issue here, that's often sidelined, but is the fact is grain colonialism and, you know, the transition, okay, like it's going to happen. And, you know, China is curving down its emissions like exponentially and going to like renewable electricity. And, you know, they're doing this through colonizing Tibet and building huge hydro dams on indigenous lands, which like Quebec is very familiar with. But then it's a matter of the how, and it's a matter of the for who. And for example, right now, when I said we need to capture more carbon than we emit, that's like the best technology that we have to capture carbon right now is trees. But even that, and then we have all those other technologies that are really like that can cause contamination, that have not been proved, that are extremely expensive, and that are mostly used, like Canada uses carbon capture technology to keep subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, because they're like subsidizing their carbon capture investments. It's done through like a bunch of mechanisms, including like just tax credits on like innovation, etc. But basically, you see that like those green technologies are a means for like these horrible industries to just keep going without questioning anything. And then it's also like land is possession, right? When we talk about conservation, when we talk about carbon credits, this can be done through like paying for conservation. But then oftentimes that means like locking indigenous communities and local communities outside of their territories and making them unable to practice their traditional culture. Oftentimes it can mean, for example, again, with the planting trees thing, like one thing that I think we're going to see increasingly is agricultural land being bought for very cheap and very unequitable conditions, or frankly just grabbed from peasant communities to plant trees on as part of the like financialization of carbon. And so that's one of the reasons why I think COPs are important, is because all of this is happening. Even if we're not winning, I think we have to know our enemy. And this is where the negotiations on climate commitments take place. It's also where all the financial, industrial, well, not all, but a lot of the financial and industrial deals take place. And so like it's an industrial fair in many ways, yet it's like the only place where states gather to discuss climate change. So like international law is profoundly flawed and a colonial construct, but it's like, yeah, right now there's nothing other than the COP to replace what a COP does. And if there's no international collaboration on climate, that's like the guarantee that we're totally cooked. And then also on the like, I think the doomism on climate has very fascist undertones. And I know that many people, like, I feel desperate about this oftentimes, but like hope is political. And when we just operate under the assumption that it's a done deal and that we can't do anything about it, what we're accepting to do is to make the like large parts of the world sacrifice zones. And that's going to affect us, but we have a lot more resources to deal with it and a lot less vulnerability in Canada than in other places. So I think that
we're one of the best countries in the world in regards to our geography. We're going to see some of the least effects, despite the fact that we're already seeing so many terrible effects. Like we're one of the safer countries.
It's much less terrible than in other places, right? We have a lot more ability to like to endure it. So I think that it's very important to realize what giving up means and to like never back down. And then, I don't think like I'm at COP for very specific reasons. I don't think everybody should come to COP. I think that what we need is a revolution. And like COPs are only going to start working if there are like strong social movements within each country. And so that's also what the climate movement sometimes fails to reiterate, is like COP is this crazy space where you have actual access. Like I used to do guerrilla diplomacy, which is just like I was assigned to the cigarette spot and I would chat with the negotiators and get intel on their strategy on like if we wanted to pass vocabulary, like to have words be adopted in the text of the decisions, then we would gather all that intel, we'd like bounce ideas with them, and like you're young, you're cute, I'm 23, I was younger at the time, I had my baby face. And so like there's this aspect of COP that's kind of crazy. But then like legal texts, you can have some small victories at COP, but then it's always about implementation. And what we see is that international law is just will not be implemented unless it's used by social movements to answer concrete, tangible, like on the ground needs for justice. And like that's what I work on. Like I work on the recognition of future generations as rights holders. And so like anti-colonial reform of international law and like how we can have like sustainable, long-term just societies. And yeah.
I think that's a really interesting discussion because hope as a political construct is like almost my entire jam. Like anyone who knows me is like, oh yeah, it's surprisingly optimistic, but I think you're right. And hope is like essentially our greatest protection against the rise of the far right and fascism. It's in despair, it's in disillusionment and the destruction of our systems that we see fascism rise, and the idea of climate change as an expression of a fascist system is definitely true because
we need to be aware of our privileges, of course. But I think the global north right now, and including a lot of global north social movements, have this conception of privilege where they feel safe. But the climate crisis is actually an interesting, like for me, how I view the climate crisis and how we should mobilize it politically is that, like, for the first time, privileged populations are actually suffering the consequences of what colonialism, imperialism, and like did, and what it means to make it so that lives can just be like sacrificed. And so I think that that's the leverage that this context is giving us, is like, okay, we have this shared interest, but then how do we mobilize it? And my take on climate hope is not, I think that anyone, because you hear people here tell you that like things are not going this bad, etc. And that's absolutely not true. I think that, climate hope is often conflated with just often is denial. And I think that we need hope in the form of like, okay, this is going to be a very difficult struggle.
Like a confrontational hope. We confront the problem, but we still maintain our hope.
We basically we have a deadline to end like the global capitalist neoliberal order. That's what the climate crisis is. And that can be a very good thing. Right now, political context is horrible, but I think, we're going to have to deal with it.
Listen, one of the biggest challenges that every person has is essentially the moment you start talking about climate change, everyone checks out. So how do we effectively communicate this?
I mean, and I'm shifting away from my like David Suzuki Foundation hat. I'm an activist and an organizer first and foremost, but I think it's about materialism and like people's material conditions. Like, I think probably that a way to bring climate back into people's minds is to tie it with the issues that they're already concerned with, like energy, poverty,
political movements.
And
Yeah.
like, I don't know, housing and climate are so related. Labor rights.
They sure are.
Like labor rights. When you work outside, like it's very basic. Houselessness. When you live outside most of the time, like climate impacts are going to hit you. And so if we're concerned about that, then we need to be concerned about like adaptation and like people's dignity, and to have like just this renewed undying commitment to human dignity, and that must include mitigation, because what we see right now, and it's so paradoxical, but like, of course, major emitters don't want to pay for the damages that they have generated through the climate crisis to countries that are the least responsible and the most affected. But also, there's an extent to which they prefer to pay modest amounts than to curb their emissions, because that means challenging the very logic of like the system and the economy, and that means like going against corporate interests. And so, yeah, we need so increasingly in these spaces here, the conversation is about adaptation and it's about paying up loss and damages. But it's very important also that, for matters of coherence, that we never give up on mitigation, on curbing emissions and finding community-centric ways to capture carbon, etc. And, so much of it is just about like environmental defenders are being killed worldwide. And that's what you hear. There was this indigenous land defender in Brazil that was killed in the state of Mato Grosso 3 weeks ago. And then, you don't see the Brazilian state really doing that. There's the whole like marco temporal thing where like by Brazil's constitution, the recognition of indigenous territories could be limited to what indigenous territories were when Brazil adopted its last constitution, 80s, not recognizing their ancestral stewardship on territories that have never been ceded, for example, and their sovereignty on these lands, most importantly. I don't know, I just came back from the Future Generations Tribunal, the East African Future Generations Tribunal that we organized in Mombasa. And we gathered testimonies from young people across 11 countries of the region. And like, I'm thinking of participant and friend Nadia from Burundi, who she has a disability affecting her foot and she needs a prosthetic to walk. And like when she was displaced as a child, because of climate catastrophes, she could no longer attend the only accessible school in the country. Like, we need to think about that so holistically, or thinking of examples like in Madagascar, they're reliant on hydroelectricity for power, but then rivers are dry, and so they have no electricity. So what are they supposed to do? And same, like thinking of another participant that we had had a pleading strategy before the International Court of Justice regarding its advisory opinion on state obligations pertaining to climate change last December in The Hague. And Patricia Gualinga, she's this amazing Quechua defender from Sarayaku in Ecuador. And, it's a big issue because the rivers are dry again. And so it's like people can go to school. It's impossible for them to access like healthcare, even going to the clinic, and let alone the hospital. So it's like all these very basic things on both like a local and a international scale. There's also like the informal economy, like that's such a large part of employment in global South countries. Like those people often don't have labor rights that are recognized, and they often work outside. But so then like we need to reform like labor law as well, because like people risk dying and risk incurring like terrible health impacts from being in the heat, from being in like polluted area, and environmental justice is also like just indissociable from all of this. But yeah, so I think that we really need to repoliticize the issue. And frankly, I'm a bit critical of us. I don't know, like I think I kind of am a chameleon in many leftist environments. And I think that like more radical organizations tend to view like climate and the environment as like this bourgeois thing. But in doing this, like that's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Like if you're not politicizing the issue, then who will? And then you have like other progressive organizations or like the media who really refrain from politicizing the issue, but because they want to be consensual. But I think that people need to understand that we need to be for real about the enormous stakes that everyone has in the game and the duty of solidarity. And like, for me, it's a question of like, will we be able to live with ourselves if like in 50 years, our countries are like held legally and morally responsible for like hundreds of millions of deaths. And that's why even in the worst case scenario, like every 10th of a degree of global temperature increase or not, or every 10th of a degree of increase that we can avoid, like is literally critical. And science is really unequivocal about the fact that every 10th of a degree is really worth fighting for. So yeah, but then that's very nebulous. And that's why I think
Let's fight tooth and nail for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I sometimes monopolize a conversation for 20 minutes to explain how climate science is extremely political.
Repoliticize climate science. It's a blue-collar issue, is the thesis that has just been presented. This is not a petite bourgeoisie. This is not the Liberal Party of Canada issue. This is not just a NPD issue, NDP issue. This is a real issue that will affect laborers globally. Thank you for joining us today. This has been On the Trail with Isaac Peltz, Janelle Lapointe, who is not a Quebecer, and Albert Lalonde, who I think is from Montreal. Thank you so much for joining us today, guys. This has been a wonderful conversation about the climate, about how this is a blue-collar, a rights issue, a labor issue, and it is time to see a change. Thank you, subscribe, share with your friends, and give me all of your money. Goodbye.